For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates. This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh. Revi. On the gist today, we're looking at the situation vis-à-vis Ukraine and how it could impact India. Our expert today joins us from Washington, D.C., Dr. Tanvi Madan, Senior Fellow in the Project on International Order and Strategy in the Foreign Policy Program and Director of the India Project at the Brookings Institution. She's also the author of the book Fateful Triangle, How China Shaped U.S.-India Relations During the Cold War. Morning, Tanvi, and thank you for giving us a time early in the morning in Washington.
Good evening to you, Amitabh, and it's good to be on the show.
Pleasure, Zaz. Just looking at the situation as it's been developing over weeks now, but far from de-escalation, it seems to be escalating on both sides. The US announcing a heightened alert of its troops for NATO, though they're still in the US. Aid, military assistance being given to the Ukraine. Russia's demands, which they are going to be apparently a written reply from the US. That's what Secretary Blinken says. But how do you view the situation as of today?
I think there's a lot we don't know. There's some things we do know, that there has been this historic buildup, at least for recent years, from Russia near the Ukraine border. They of course have troops already within Ukraine in the Crimean Peninsula, which they took in 2014, as well as in the Donbass region. And you've seen kind of a lot of dialogues to try to de-escalate the situation, to find a negotiated solution. So we do know kind of about the dialogue. We know about the buildup. We've seen now NATO reinforcing kind of troops, and you've seen a lot of countries in the eastern flank particularly express their concerns. But there's also still things we don't want. What does Russia want? What does President Putin want? How far is it willing to go to achieve those demands? That is basically the question: is war likely? Is a Russian invasion of Ukraine likely? And then what countries should do to deter a Russian attack on Ukraine? And if it does attack Ukraine, then the question is, how are they going to respond to one? And by countries, I mean many who are also India's partners, like Russia is. And I think there's a broader question, which is more related to international law, which is and norms, which is, are Russian demands and or the approach it is taking justified? And so I think there's a lot here that has to do with power, that has to do with principle. And we are seeing, as you said, so far not a de-escalation, but as people say, it is good that we are seeing continued negotiations. So as long as people are talking, there is hope that a diplomatic solution will be found.
So again, as you pointed out in your writings, China will be the only country that's backing Russia, apart from, of course, Belarus and countries like that. Linked to that is something that you brought up a little in your writing as well. Digital Night Library says China utilized the 1962 missile crisis, Cuban Missile Crisis, distraction to attack India. Is India looking at the Ukraine crisis with that paradigm?
I think, you have to, history kind of doesn't often repeat itself. Sometimes it rhymes. So there are obviously differences today, including kind of in the Russia-China relationship, then the Soviet-China relationship. What we did see during the 1962 war is that there was at a crucial moment when the Chinese were really pressing. You did see the Cuban Missile Crisis was going on at the same time. And so the Soviet Union chose ally China versus friend India at that moment for a brief period. But nonetheless, it mattered because this meant both diplomatic pressure on India, with the Soviet leadership telling India, you need to just make the concessions to China that they want. You saw Sergei Radchenko, the historian who's a specialist in Sino-Soviet relations, has written about how the Soviets shared intelligence on India with the Chinese. And you did see them stalling the supply of MiGs at the time. 62s at the times in that period. Now, subsequently, once the Cuban Missile Crisis lifted, they returned to kind of a more neutral position. But that would be at the back of the minds, I suspect, of some in Delhi, that because India is still dependent, not just on kind of new deals, but as you know, as your audience knows, on Russian military equipment, but also spare parts and things like that. The last thing you want in the middle of a crisis is a Russia that is not neutral, and that it'll move away from its neutrality between China and India because a crisis in Ukraine, just like the crisis over the Cuban Missile Crisis, will make it more beholden to Beijing. That it'll need Beijing's diplomatic support, or at least its acquiescence. And so if Beijing says to it, slow down supplies, stall supplies to India, you can say something like it's for COVID reasons or others. This is a problem now, and it's a problem in general, but it's particularly a problem for India at a time that it is in an active situation at the boundary that, as spring nears in particular, could escalate again. So I think we don't know the probability or the likelihood. Russia obviously has interests with India. It will not want India to think it's unreliable. But nonetheless, one has to plan for these things and be prepared for it. But I think this is why you will see a Delhi that does not want this situation in Ukraine to escalate, because it will push Russia closer to China, even though Beijing has not taken a stance on the Russia-Ukraine crisis yet. But you are going to, for example, and I watch very closely the Xi-Putin summit next week to see where China stands on some of these issues.
But going into the immediate past, or even slightly further than that, not as far back as 1962, but say in 1971, the circumstances were different. Even at the height of the Galwan crisis, Russia didn't stop any of its arms supplies or given to. We don't know whether the Chinese asked them to. Does that, like you're saying, the probability of that happening?
So, 71 and 2022, very different situations. In 71, the Chinese were perhaps more of rivals to the Soviets were more concerned about China than perhaps at that time they were even of the United States. In 69, Russia-China had actually had a border clash in the Usuri River clashes. And so at that time, Soviet-China relations were very antagonistic. So it was in Soviet interest to help India. In fact, at that time, in 69, 70, they were even supplying Pakistan, which they were trying to wean away from China at the time. And so you did see Soviet interest at that time, Moscow being interested in helping countries against China. 2020, 21, 22, very different situation. Where President Putin has routinely listed China as Russia's closest partner. He's listed India as a close partner, but second, after China. You've had him and Foreign Minister Lavrov say that Russia-China relations are better than they ever have been. So this does give Indian policymakers pause. It should give Indian policymakers pause. That's why I don't think you see them expect Russia to take India's side as it did in 1971 and through the 70s. Against China to balance China. But I think what they hope for, and they would like to see Russian neutrality. In terms of arms supplies, at the end of the day, it's not just a buyer who's dependent. If India is one of its largest export markets. If your customer starts thinking you're unreliable, and they already have other options, whether it's the French, whether it's the Israelis, whether it's the Americans, you don't want to, you want to keep that market intact. And not to mention, India is not just importing from others, it is also now moving to defense production indigenously. And so, Russia in any case is seeing headwinds in defense trade in India. Russia, they would not want to. Having said that, the fact that you had to have the Indian defense minister go just after the Galwan clash to Moscow to ensure that supplies wouldn't be stalled. In crises, you shouldn't have to go to your friends, especially your defense minister leaving the country. The fact that he had to go and then on return said, they assured me that supplies would continue. And then more recently, after the Russia-India 2+2, the fact again that he said we conveyed to the other side, to Russia, that we will figure out who our friends are. And part of that is ensuring supplies during a crisis. Now, I'm paraphrasing it, but the fact that you have officials taking this stance tells you that the hope is that Russia is time tested, that it will be reliable, not just because of emotion, but because of real market concerns that Russia might have about losing India as a market and losing India even in diplomatic support. Nonetheless, policymakers have to plan for these eventualities, particularly because, as important as India might be to Russia, currently Moscow sees Beijing as even more important to their interests.
Just Matara has a question for you, Tanvi. What is your view on the German Navy chief's comments about Putin and Crimea?
Look, I think, at one level, and I will say this, in when history is written, I say this as a historian, that'll be a footnote. I think the broader issue is the Russia-Ukraine crisis in the context of which that was made, but a reflection also of the fact that within Europe and I think even within Germany, there are differences on how to deal with Russia. Now, I will say there is consensus amongst the West and not just US and Europe, but you've seen the Japanese Prime Minister take a pretty strong stance on this as well, that there will be sanctions and punitive, at least economic actions against Russia if it does militarily attack Ukraine again. And so you've seen that unity, but I think his comments did reflect some differences. And you've seen, Germany continue to engage Russia economically. They sought and received kind of a waiver, at least so far. That will change if there's any Russian action against Ukraine for their Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. And you've seen, for example, even in France, President Macron in the past called for greater stability between the West and Russia. You've seen India do that. You've seen the Japanese do that. But you also see the reaction that the German government wanted to convey that his views were not those of the German government. And mind you, this is a coalition government led by the SPD, which in Germany is considered kind of the relatively, and this is all relative, the kind of softer power or party on foreign policy, and particularly Russia. And so I think you saw both, the fact that his comments reflected some difference, as well as the fact that he had to resign. That these are not the views of. So I know his comments were met with getting great pleasure in India because it did echo at least some of them. I don't think India would agree necessarily with his points about clash of civilizations. Perhaps some might. But that that he did his views didn't meet those of, and particularly in the crisis. So I think the way I put it is briefly is he did four things that I suspect didn't go down well. One, he contradicted the German government position on Russia as well as China, and he did so in the middle of a crisis. And when you're a military officer in uniform representing your government, you don't get to have a personal opinion. Second, he criticized the civilian leadership. During the course, I think people didn't hear that part, but he did. I think you also saw, for instance, a particularly thing that did get people upset in Germany. I know it didn't get too much coverage in India, but in Germany, sensitivities going back to the Second World War and before that, and then the Nazis, to put it bluntly, that he's framing this clash of civilizations. When he said, as a Roman Catholic, I'm making this point. This is a sensitive issue in Germany. And then finally, again, didn't get much attention because so much else did. He criticized Indian foreign policy. He turned around and said, you guys have bilateral partnerships. Bilateral partnerships mean nothing. You need alliances. So, he's critiquing India's strategic autonomy and staying out of alliances. So you don't do these things, and I think we've seen the end result. But as I said, the more important point is what this says about Germany, about the debate within Germany. But as a lot of observers of Europe will say that on the issues like sanctions, there is a fair amount of unity, that there will be punitive action if, just as there was after the Crimea takeover annexation in 2014, which, mind you, from India's purposes, that Russian annexation of Crimea, which India still has not recognized as far as I know, led to a ever deeper, closer Russia-China relationship, in part due to those sanctions. But you will see a repeat of that again if you both the sanctions and Russia moving closer to China if another military attack occurs.
If that happens and all the situation worsens, you also point out that it puts paid to any hopes of U.S.-Russia rapprochement, and that makes it extremely challenging for India to balance between the U.S. and Russia, two of its strategic partners.
In an ideal world, if you think about what India's interests have been, it is to maintain relations with multiple partners. Because India and people sometimes say this is irrational. As a historian, I will tell you it's not, because Indian policymakers have had to deal with unreliable partners and they don't want to depend on any one country. And so this idea to diversify your partnership portfolio is not an irrational idea. It is, in fact, you could argue, even sensible. And so India has wanted to maintain different relationships. Part of that is, as I said, dependencies already on Russia, and Russia supplying India with certain military equipment that others don't. Also, India does not want to see Russia be a spoiler, whether at the UN Security Council, at the NSG, Nuclear Suppliers Group, other places. So I think, India's wanted to have, this is an Indian interest, to be able to balance US-Russia relations, to keep China. And one of the reasons is not just so that India can do business with the US and can do business with Russia, but India's idea has been that if US, Russia, or the West and Russia more broadly have stable relations, have a rapprochement, that will keep Russia from deepening its relations with China. And what you will see is, and you did see, there was this idea that, as the Vice Admiral said, Putin wants respect. Well, President Biden did show him respect, and you did see, as Ambassador Raghavan, I think, with your colleague the other day, on maybe just even yesterday, mentioned that you did see President Biden meet with President Putin in Geneva in this last summer. You saw a series of U.S.-Russia dialogue after many years. This was to give, and part of this idea was that you stabilize relations with Russia, you can focus, the Biden administration could focus on the Indo-Pacific, on the China challenge. Well, the problem is now the kind of Russian military buildup has already weakened the advocates of that approach, which is to actually reach some sort of stability with Russia, because they are now criticizing President Biden for that outreach to Putin, saying he took it as a sign, not just that you're showing him respect, of weakness, that he could press you, that he could actually take advantage of the opportunity. Much like people criticized, Prime Minister Modi for things like Wuhan or the Mamallapuram summit with Xi. That, here India, or here in that case the US, was showing respect, saying we want to stabilize relations, and the other side takes it as a sign of weakness. So, now one shouldn't say that the Russians don't have security concerns at hand. One also shouldn't say that, there isn't a discussion could be had on European strategic, what the strategic posture looks like, what the dispensation, what NATO's focus, etc. But you're not going to see it happen at a time, let's just say these concessions on the West is not going to have these discussions with a gun to its head. And that might be Putin's hope, that, he might be saying, let me put pressure, the West will make concessions. Unfortunately, it's had the opposite impact so far, at least, which is you've had now US-Russia relations on moving things forward. It's now all crisis talks, which has stalled. It is now making it harder in Congress to take that approach. You are also having now, if his idea was to stall NATO, if you are Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, Belarus, not Belarus, Romania, you actually think NATO is now the best thing, entering NATO is the best thing you ever did, because the country that Putin is pointing to or targeting is the one country that's not in NATO. So when people say, this shows NATO is anachronistic, it's a Cold War relic, to those countries on kind of the eastern flank of Europe that did join NATO, and that was their choice as much as it was of NATO to allow them to join, they are saying, so the problem is this stalls the very thing that India wants, which is a more stable Russia-West front, so that everybody can focus their efforts on balancing China. And so, as I, the long answer to your question, but that, I think it is a very important one, that this puts paid not just to potential kind of U.S.-Russia. Now, if you do find a diplomatic solution, this could set the stage for strategic dialogue. But if there's a Russian military attack, another invasion of Ukraine, you're not going to see that. And the other thing that will become harder for India, even countries like Japan and France, that like India had been pushing for this stability, for this rapprochement with Russia, even they will stop saying this. The Japanese already have, because not gotten much attention, but the Russians have also been building up, having kind of increasing their military deployments on the Kuril Islands, which Russia and Japan have a dispute about, and then doing joint exercises around Japan with China that has been of concern to Tokyo.
Question for you, Tanvi, from Makaran Joshi, who says, in case of conflict between Russia and Ukraine, do you expect military intervention from NATO, or will it be limited to sanctions only? And linked to that again is what you've been talking about, is if there are increased sanctions, and they're talking about the severest form of economic sanctions, that again brings up an extremely challenging situation for India.
Yes, and I think there's a to kind of answer the kind of first part of that question, and you cut out a little bit there. So could you just repeat the first part?
Yeah, he asks in
military
case of a
intervention.
conflict, military intervention from NATO.
So I think we don't know, and I think ambiguity is part of the point. At least public ambiguity. I suspect part of the discussions that you've seen, at the highest levels between US and Russia, but also Russia and Europe, is probably a much franker discussion about what the consequences will be. Because Ukraine is not in NATO, you are unlikely to see, or you might, I mean, part of this is, as I said, we don't know, but there is no obligation for the West, for NATO, to intervene militarily directly. But what you are seeing is a couple of things in the military front. You've seen NATO reinforce its forces along kind of near Russia and Ukraine. And second, you've been seeing military assistance to Ukraine increase, military supplies, training, etc. These are the kind of things that Russia wanted to prevent. So it's a bit, this is why I draw the analogies kind of with China. You say, why does China do certain things against India that's actually counterproductive to what China was trying to its own objectives? I have that question about President Putin as well. Why are you doing the very things that are making things like NATO, NATO upgrading its forces near you, Ukraine being supplied militarily? This is what we're seeing. So when you see military intervention, I think that's what we're seeing thus far. But I think, and then we've heard that there will be potentially a range of sanctions, some of which will hurt Russia more than others. So it also depends on the graded kind of escalation of those sanctions. So I think what we're likely to see much more of that. And then the question, this goes to a very fundamental question: how do you deter countries? And this is a challenging, and Ukraine doesn't have nuclear weapons. It's not in an alliance, so that's not going to do it. And so, the question is, can you find this solution? And can these discussions, in which are much franker than what we hear publicly, is what the U.S. is saying, the West is saying, Japan is saying that it will do in case of the Russian military action against Ukraine. Will this be sufficient to deter President Putin, or are his goals? And that's the other thing. We don't know what he wants. Is it just to get concessions from the West? Is it to remove the US from Europe entirely? Is it that he actually believes, as he said in the past, that Ukraine's not a country, it's really part of Russia, a Khand Russia, if you will? Is that what he wants? And so we don't know. And some of whether he will be deterred and what the response will be will depend on what is it he wants and how far he's willing to go get it. Just very briefly, sanctions will, I think, hurt in two ways. One, just like after, and we've already seen how the sanctions that went in place after the Russian annexation of Crimea already have made India's job harder, both in terms of actually making defense deals with or energy deals, but also on that last point with Russia. India and Russia have been trying to diversify the relationship. President Putin has repeatedly expressed frustration that it's a very one-note relationship. It's defense trade or defense broadly. What about he wants to expand? If you want to expand India-Russia relations into energy, other businesses, etc., this becomes harder if there's another round of even higher sanctions. I think the second thing, so it makes India it costlier for India. India might find payment mechanisms, alternatives, etc., but it becomes harder. Second, it starts to complicate India's relations, sanctions, and then how India will have to deal with them will complicate things like India-U.S. relations or India-Europe relations, because it'll make it harder. Then you have to find waivers and things like that. CAATSA waivers up for discussion. I think the administration would still like to give that to India, but it becomes much harder if this scenario plays out with military action. Third thing, which is another economic dimension, which I didn't mention in my article, but Pranab Samanta mentioned in his Indian Express article very well, which is the energy prices. What will, as it is, they're higher than they were a couple of years ago. What will this do to kind of energy prices? Which the last thing India needs right now is higher energy prices. Last thing the world needs, because of inflation rates, etc. Is that, and frankly, you will see stock markets tank world over because of any such crisis that has the potential to be larger. So I think for India, a number of these, and then finally, I mean, it goes back to the China thing question for India. Sanctions on Russia, as they did after 2014, will push Russia closer to China. The Chinese might not take a side, but they will, support. You've already seen their news outlets be very supportive of the Russian position, and I think you will see again this goes against India's interests, but this is partly what those sanctions will do as well.
You mentioned it briefly, and you had written about it. CAATSA, the bipartisan support for what is seeming possibly a waiver for the S-400s. Now, if there's military action by the Russians, that could rapidly change at Capitol, right?
Well, you will see. So you have seen there's still some objections, including, you haven't seen people, for example, like Senator Menendez, who is chair of the Foreign Relations Committee and therefore pretty influential, be supportive. In fact, he is a Russia hawk and has said that we should not be giving waivers. You also saw recently the administration not have the easiest time trying to get this. Trying to ensure that Ted Cruz failed to try to kind of prevent Germany from going through with this Nord Stream 2 deal with Russia. That goes through. It didn't go through the bill that he put forward, but it tells you kind of where the sentiment is. It did get the majority of votes, where you did see it didn't get enough, but the sentiment of Congress was against kind of giving Russia a pass, so to speak, or even very close U.S. allies a pass on these issues with Russia. Now, so you do have the kind of the sentiment on Congress is changing. Does this mean that India won't get a waiver? Not necessarily, because for one, it is still at the discretion. At this point, the decision is in the hands of the administration, but it does have to get congressional buy-in. And the question is, even people like Senator Mark Warner, who's the Democratic senator from Virginia, or Senator Ted Cruz, the Republican senator from Texas, who have been supportive of India getting a waiver, it becomes harder to get their support because they do care about, as they see it, Russian aggression against Ukraine and where Russia is on these questions. And so it's not that India will not get it, but you are now having to expend more political capital that India has built on the Hill, more time, more effort, diplomatic capital, political capital, to try to get that waiver when that's the last thing you need to be spending time on. So will it rule it out? I don't know, but it will make it harder to, you just have to kind of, it gets to be a kind of a much more delicate dance than it would have been even otherwise.
Now you've pointed out the various dimensions of fallout that India's interests, foreign policy, ambitions will have if there is a Russian invasion of Ukraine. So what should we be doing?
So, I think one of
I
the
mean,
kind of
we don't have
tougher
any
things.
skin in the game to influence either side to change
So,
what's happening
well,
there. But
part of
apart
the
from that,
problem is,
our interests.
yeah, no, India does have skin in the game. Part of it is it is a tough thing because it's partly India doesn't want to be involved. But the question is, India is not involved enough to be able to change the fundamentals of the discussion. So there are a few things India could do, and I suspect some of this is already happening. The kind of things I wrote aren't a secret to people in
Yeah.
South Bloc. They understand these issues, and you have people who understand these dynamics have been there during previous crises as well. And so, I think you one thing you will see is, I think, for India to be in touch with the countries actually involved, and particularly, there's still kind of limited interaction with the Ukrainians, but that there is still India has a diplomatic relationship with Ukraine. So, try to get a sense of what is happening, convey your concerns in private. This is not going to happen. You're not going to have India publicly say to Russia, don't do this or criticize. I don't think that should be an expectation. I do think you could see, and I think you've already seen Foreign Secretary Vardhan Shringla talk to his
Yeah.
counterpart, Deputy Secretary of
Wendy
State Wendy
Sherman.
Sherman. I don't know if there are discussions also taking place that we don't know about on the Russian side for India to convey its concerns and perhaps the positions it is willing to take or not willing to take. I think the second thing India should be doing is being in touch with its other diplomatic partners, whether that is France, whether that is Japan, to try to get, whether that's Canberra for that matter, to try to get their sense of what is going on, the approach that they are planning to take. And then I think the third thing that India should be doing is plan for the scenario that this Russian military, you hope that diplomatic negotiations take place, but a whole series of planning about suppose this eventuality happens. And that's going to be a range, and it has to be kind of a it's not just a foreign ministry thing. It will have to be a broader set of things that India will have to. So one is the safety of Indian citizens in Ukraine. By MEA count, there are about 7,500, might be a bit dated, but regardless, there are about that many Indians in Ukraine. Ensure their safety and security. Second thing is you need to plan for things like a hike in oil prices. And mind you, this could come, just as from a political aspect, countries going to elections in various states. You are also, I think, you also need to plan, for instance, about the scenario we're talking about, which is suppose this is China related, which is two things to plan for. Is one, what if China, now there are very different views on whether this might happen. You need to be prepared militarily that if China decides it's going to take advantage of the West's and the US distraction and focus on Europe, I shouldn't say it's distraction because these are serious issues, but the US being focused, the Europeans, the Japanese being focused on Europe. What if China decides, I want to take advantage of this, perhaps after the Olympics, as spring sets in, to take certain action against India? India is not an alliance, so unlike a Taiwan scenario, it might decide this is easier to. So you have to be prepared that that's a possibility. So militarily, I think there's also the question of India has to be thinking about, okay, what does this scenario do to Russian military supplies during, if there is kind of a escalation with China. So I think there's a series of things that, and then thinking about how do you pay for alternative for existing deals that you have, etc. So when people say, look, we can't do anything about this, so we shouldn't think about it, you just can't. As we've seen in recent years, what happens in Europe doesn't stay in Europe, and what happens in India doesn't stay kind of in India. So India is, while it's not directly involved, it has stakes. And I would say this doesn't get much attention because you'll often have Indian officials, and they're not the only ones, and they're not necessarily wrong, that precedent and power, a precedent and principle don't mean very much. That at the end of the day, power determines everything. Except India is arguing against that very fact in Asia, saying China as a powerful country should not get to unilaterally dominate the region. It should not have a sphere of influence. It should not be able to violate our territorial integrity. And it should not be able to dictate smaller countries in Asia, including India's choices. So those are principles. So when I say that, why does principle matter? For India, which at this point does not get to dictate everything around it, it's just not that. It is more powerful than it was, but not that. There is an interest, we have a stake in international law, rules-based order, as everybody puts it. Why do we have that? Because in a world where countries, have spheres of influence, violate territorial integrity, etc., that is a problem for India. So you depend on international law so that there's not chaos, so that you're not descending into a period where everybody starts doing this. And so I think there's this question, while it's dismissed as yes, even if Russia does this and the US doesn't, the China will read this as a bad precedent. That's dismissed. And often people say, oh, international law, what does that mean? But I think, there's also reason, for example, India hasn't recognized the Russian annexation of Crimea, which is, India does believe in international law. And so when I ask, people, let's say, yes, Russia is a partner of India. It helped India in 71, in the 70s, in the 80s. But there are fundamental questions to ask, and I'll ask three. Do you believe in a spheres of influence world? Do you believe that countries' territorial integrity should not be violated? And I think the kind of final part of that is, do you believe that countries, smaller countries, or less powerful countries should have strategic autonomy? And so when you think about why these issues matter, it's not to say that Russia doesn't have security concerns, but is it justified in invading another country, annexing its air territory for those security concerns? That is a question to ask. So, with the understanding that Russia is a close partner, I think these are questions that do need to be asked.
Tanvi, Dr. Madan, thanks so much for your time and your thoughts on StratNews Global.
Thanks so much.
And just a reminder to our viewers, do subscribe to our YouTube channel, like this video, and share the link with your personal and professional contacts. I'm just going to put out a link also if you want to help support us financially. It's there in our YouTube description as well. You've been watching The Gist on StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi.